Okay, we should get into this.
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
JoJo's...
The story of the Joestar family.
This is the story of the Joestar family. Hey, Joey!
Hey, Joey Jojo Jr. Shabadoo. Alright. Do you want to lead into it, or do you want me to lead
What are you talking about? We just led into it.
Shit. We're in it right now.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome to a club chat.
Fuck.
God damn it. Alright, you go.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sam.
And I'm Kyle.
And welcome to the story of the Joestar family.
We're going to be doing a club chat on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure today, a series that both of us are familiar with and both quite enjoy. But not just JoJo. Specifically, we're going to be doing a talk about sort of the evolution of fights in JoJo.
We're going to be looking at where we've been and how we got to where we are now. And by where we are now, we mean the middle of part 5. Just for anyone wondering, we won't be talking about spoilers past where the anime has reached at our time of recording again. The latest episode was the Metallica versus King Crimson fight, the second half of that. So we'll be talking about everything leading up to that point, everything that's already aired, and previous seasons, but nothing past it, so nothing from the manga.
So to start our little journey through time, we're going to start at part 1 and 2, specifically with the introduction of Hamon as a concept. Hamon is very simply just a bunch of kung fu nonsense. It was Araki's earliest attempt at some form of, greater battle manga. It clearly has heavy inspiration from Your Fist of the North Star, manga like that, but unfortunately, in the fights that we see early on, there isn't a whole lot of unique creativity. It's really straightforward, it's a lot of just punching back and forth, and a lot of the bizarre elements of JoJo really just come from the characters and their interactions.
And the larger plot as a whole of vampires and zombies.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're going to be kind of lumping part 1 and 2 together just because the Hamon was... Well, at this point, it's a bit of a footnote. It was a major thing at the time, and it did set the early groundwork for JoJo's as a whole, but by the time part 3 rolled around, it wasn't really necessary at all. We only see it once outside of parts 1 and 2.
We see, a little bit of an expanding upon Hamon as a concept in Battle Tendency, in the way that, Joseph starts training in Italy, in the way that Caesar's bubbles end up becoming a more unique element to his character, but beyond those things, it is still a really limited medium to illustrate greater fights. So, as a whole, we can kind of see that Araki even noticed a change needed to be made.
Oh, for sure. You can absolutely see that Araki feels that he's starting to box himself in a little bit with the Hamon. Caesar's bubbles are great. I think they're a really cool application of how the Hamon works with, breathing in water. But there's just not much else that stands out besides them. Yes, you have Joseph's clacker volley and things like that, but there's very limited places for it to go. It has its use, and had JoJo as a story kept the Hamon, I don't think it would have gone much of anywhere else.
Yeah, and on top of that, we see in the way that the adversaries are portrayed, you've got your early vampires with Dio kind of being the pinnacle of that, and then as a means of stepping up their game, we've got the Pillar Men, who are quite literally the apex predators of the vampires, and beyond that, you really can't go much higher without it becoming absurd in its power scaling.
Which is actually a problem that JoJo ends up being really good at fixing. Once it gets to the main event of JoJo's...
The main event is obviously Stans, and part 3, Stardust Crusaders, is a very clear, very obvious point of interest for a lot of fans.
But yeah, no, I've seen countless people just want to jump in at part 3, and I have to kind of coax them into watching parts 1 and 2 once they've watched some of the later stuff. I have one of my best friends watched part 4, part 3, part 5, part 1, part 2, which is a nightmare for me, a purist who not only read the manga, but did everything in order.
Yeah. Now, obviously, part 3 has the main concept that will carry us throughout the rest of the series, but, you kind of need that background. Still, stands are a really, really interesting concept. It is literally the idea of let's give everyone an incredibly unique and hyper-specific ability, while also being able to give them amazing physical abilities that don't take away from the character themselves. It's a really, really good catch-all for writing fights because you don't have to worry about the characters versus their abilities. You can really differ those two, and, you can create fantastic and bizarre situations that we know as JoJo fans we've grown accustomed to. So part 3, obviously, early on, we're getting introduced to that, and as a result, things are kind of simple in the way that they're set up.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. In part 3, we start off with very much the classic way that people put it as punch ghosts. That's basically what they are. Star Platinum punches things really good, he has great dexterity, but prior to the very end of part 3, that's pretty much it. Then you have powers such as fire, and except for one time in the beginning, Emerald Splash, very much just like the go-to abilities, the very cut and dry. This one has a sword. But I think a major point of charisma for the stands as well is you get not only the character designs, but also these just like very wacky, very fantastic designs for the stand bodies. I don't know about you, Kyle, but I always really love to see, I'll see a character and I'm just thinking, okay, so what's their stand gonna look like, What is Araki going to concoct for this one?
There is very clearly a attention to detail put into the design of every stand that really makes it a feature presentation, getting to see what they actually look like. So no, 100%, that is a major appeal of stands as a concept, but early on, like we said, they are more on the simple side. You've got stands that are like literally a boat, stands that are literally the sun. They lack a certain element of creativity, but they're still good.
I'd say that that's where Araki starts to get the ball rolling with experimenting with, how diverse stands can be, though. Because at first you have them very much as these humanoid things, and then you get into the midpoint of Stardust Crusaders, where you do see the boat and the sun and the car, which in hindsight are very strange, but I do think it did lend itself well to kind of this exploration of stands and this kind of very early experimentation.
Yeah, I think if we kind of look at the inspiration for a lot of these early stands, Araki is very straightforward in saying that a lot of his work is inspired by horror, and so the idea that he is taking a lot of very literal concepts like the idea of being chased by a car, the idea of burning to death in the desert, these more literal fears
very tactile fears.
Yeah, that can be illustrated in more basic stands. That stuff kind of gets out of the way early and allows Araki to build upon it in the future with more unique ideas that are very specific to his work. And as we get further into part 3, we can start to see that already happening, especially with the Egyptian god stands. That, I think, is where Araki slowly begins that incline into, these wholly unique ideas. Stuff like Oingo and Boingo, for instance.
I'd say those two stand out quite a bit just because, while earlier stands, not all were specifically angled towards fighting. Everything had an application in that sense, but with Oingo and Boingo's stand, Tote and Num are the first time we see stands that are very specifically not for battling, and they have almost no practical use, which makes for me at least, one of the most standout episodes of part 3, which I'm not a huge fan of, in that you see these two just kind of jumping through all these hoops, doing all these hilarious things to try and get at this pack of very dangerous stand users when they themselves do not have any physical abilities really to stand up to them with.
Yeah.
I also do want to point out, this is the first time that we see a team-up on the part of the villains, which...
Oh, yeah.
I'll come back to this later, and then again even further later on, but I do want to put a pin in that and say this is the first time we see a villain team-up.
Oh, yeah. No, but the idea of these fights that don't necessarily have to be a straight-out brawl is explored a little bit here, and we also see it built upon in the fights against the Darby brothers. This idea that suspense itself can come from all of these different sources, the idea of gambling as a method of really creating these invested fights, the different methods that which battle can take place. That stuff starts to be the springboard for later, greater ideas. And so definitely the end of part 3 is Araki's attempt at trying out different mediums and different types of stands that could very well create a whole other type of scene that we haven't even possibly conceived of in these earlier parts of Part 3.
For the end, I don't want to spend too much time on it, because while the fight with the world is a really great fight, it does kind of just come out to a brawl again. It's a brawl with special abilities. A really great one, but we don't see as much experimentation there as with other stands.
Mm-hmm.
And before we go, Kyle, you forgot one of the most, unique and important stands in Part 3.
Oh?
Yeah, you forgot our boy Kenny G, tenor sax.
Oh, of course. How could I forget tenor sax, the most important stand in all of Part 3, the illusion stand that is Dio's mansion.
Yes.
The most crucial.
Of course.
Literally just exists as a roadblock for the Stardust Crusaders.
Dies off screen.
It's so bad. But, that stands can do anything, so might as well.
Anyway, let's get into one of my favorite parts, which I'm going to say at the start of every part now.
Yeah.
Part 4.
Diamond is unbreakable. No, Diamond is unbreakable. I'm going to come out and say right now, because I think it's important to illustrate this so that I don't seem biased. Part 4 is currently my favorite part of all of them, but it has a far different scale than the other two because it is more reserved in the story that it is telling. There is still tension there, but it isn't a world-traveling adventure, and death isn't this ever-present thing. It is a small town adventure in Morio.
And like you said, one of the main contrasts between the parts that sandwich Part 4 is not every battle is life or death. Many of them are more of just hey, we're gonna teach you a lesson for being mean to our friends.
Hell yeah.
In Part 3, a lot of the fights, there is quite a bit of tension. There is the Joestars and co are probably gonna die if they lose, but we don't see them straight out murdering their opponents in the end, which is in contrast to, of course, Part 5. But Part 4 is very much kind of safer, more low-key, more reserved, like you said. And because of that, it kind of ends up being Araki's sandbox for messing with really kind of out there abilities as far as stands go. And we see him pushing the boundaries even further in Part 4.
There are all of these really interesting ideas presented in not only the abilities that we see, but also the different forms of stands. The idea of colony stands, stuff like Bad Company and Harvest. These new ideas are experimented with because we kind of have the time and space to do it. Viewers understand what a stand is at its core, but there is still a lot of breathing room there. There's still a lot of room to move around, so naturally, Araki takes that understanding, builds upon it, and further creates newer, unique ideas.
For sure. We also see a lot more of the non-lethal type stands that I kind of talked about earlier with Oingo Boingo. These stands that don't really have any practical use as killing machines. You have, just countless of them. You have Cinderella, you have Heaven's Door, you have Harvest, Pearl Jam, which actively heals people. Part 4 is littered with these stands that couldn't really hold their own in a fight. They're so circumstantial, they have to have very specific build up to them to make them work. I mean, not really Heaven's Door so much. Heaven's Door is just, what's up, I'm God.
I can do whatever now. Thanks.
Rohan, best boy.
Yeah, no. I give you that.
I have his figurine. He's watching me. I can't say anything otherwise.
It's true, he'll get you. But further on that idea, we have all of these non-lethal stands and all of these unique abilities, but that's nothing to say about the users as well. In Part 3, a lot of the users were just kind of nobodies. You can remember the stands because the stands are unique, but 9 times out of 10, you're not really gonna remember anything about the actual user. Yeah, sure, I remember the fight against the sun, but do I remember much about Arabia Fats? Not really.
I didn't even remember his name.
Exactly. But Part 4, you have these characters, these actual people living in this small town who we get to see more of, naturally, because most of these fights are non-lethal, but we become invested in who they are, and Araki now experiments with the idea of attaching actual unique characters to these stands that sometimes even complement the abilities that they've been given.
I mean, how many people who had no knowledge of Jojo going in, or Part 4, thought that Rohan, of all people, would end up being, part of the main hero crew?
Yeah.
Who thought this absolute crazy shut-in manga author would end up playing a vital part in taking down the big bad?
Indeed, Sam. Who thought that this very clearly illustrated self-insert
this very
character
clever
would ever
man who only exists only in the manga, has no relation to Araki himself.
Not in any way. Don't look at the image that Araki drew of himself with Rohan.
Behind the curtain.
No, but there's a lot more personality in Part 4, not only in the design of the stands, but also in the characters that we're seeing, in the world around us, and it slowly starts to become what we are familiar with in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. This is the ever-present bizarre feeling. It starts to be a lot more apparent in Part 4 specifically.
And honestly, I think it makes you care so much more about the ultimate goal of the characters involved. You know, you end up really getting to know this town and the people, and so you can't help but, like, cheer for them to win. Not only in the sense of, like, oh, I want to see a good fight, I want to see Dio get taken down, but I want to see Raimi finally be able to rest in peace. I want to be sure Morio is safe.
Absolutely. That is, I think, the main driving thing for a lot of people liking Part 4 as much as they do. There is so much more to be invested in. There's so many more interesting characters and interesting motives for all of your major players.
But yeah, so to sum up Part 4 before we kind of wrap up that part here, it really does become this, like, experimental testing ground for Araki, where you can write these low-tension, contained stories that might have some effect on the plot later on, might add some characters, but they also might just be these points of intrigue, you know? Like, there would be no place for something like Superfly in Part 3, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just this really bonkers idea that, you know, Araki really had the room to throw at the wall and see what happened.
Yeah, and if your characters are literally just a bunch of high schoolers who are kind of doing whatever on their lunch hour, you can do that. You can say, all right, now we're going to go see the electrical tower on the corner of town. Now we're going to go check out a rumor about a weird alley. We can do whatever.
And so, if you remember from earlier, I said Oingo and Boingo were our first villain team-up. The end of Part 4 is another notable place, too, because we see our second villain team-up. Kind of. I mean, Stray Cat isn't so much a villain as, like, a feral stand. But we do see this, like, combining of powers to make something greater than the sum of its parts, something absolutely devastating.
Yeah, I think the idea of meshing Killer Queen with Stray Cat it's still in that experimental phase of the partnership between stand users, but it shows this understanding of the weakness in certain stands and how we can build upon that to create a more dynamic fight. We've seen Killer Queen in action, we understand how the bomb system works, but if we take that weakness in it being more close range and we add this element of invisible bullets, suddenly we can create way more extravagant fights. We actually have a new sense of threat in what's going on, and we don't have to rely on the idea of bite the dust, which, again, it takes this idea of manipulating time, which we saw in Part 3, but builds upon it in such a way that we can create a fight that is more based in a single character who doesn't even have a stand overcoming these, like, stable time loops. Making Groundhog Day into an actual fight is fascinating.
Nightmare. I have to say, so we've been kind of building Part 4 as like, oh, it's very low tension, you know, it's kind of hang out. But I have to say, I think the Bites the Dust fight, when I originally read it in the manga, was the highest tension there has ever been for me reading JoJo's or watching JoJo's. Just because by the end, by that final loop, there is so much at stake. You've seen these characters die over and over again, and you know they're running out of chances.
Yeah, 100%.
It's incredible, you know, it's really the cherry on top of Part 4, which is a really, really solid part. You see so much great variety in the types of stand powers and the fights.
And so with all of that said, and with all of that built upon and experimented with, the natural progression would be to take all of the strengths of Part 4 and all of the strengths of Part 3 and combine the two. And the result would be Part 5.
Golden Wind or Vento Aureo. Now, like Kyle did with the last part, I do need to come out and say I'm biased towards Part 5. It is by far my favorite part. If you know anything about me, you know that I really love Part 5. And now, that said, I'm still gonna say, I think Part 5 is a shining example of Araki taking what he has learned and applying it to make a solid story with some of the best fights in all of JoJo's.
I have to absolutely agree.
From the very beginning, we're getting some really interesting stuff. I mean, like, Bruno versus Giorno is a very tense fight, and there's not so much, like, tripping over oneself when it comes to figuring out the abilities. Araki, for the most part, I mean, there is some stuff with gold experience. He knows what he wants to do. He has these ideas for powers. He has sticky fingers, which is a really interesting stand. It's simple in concept, but it can be used in so many ways, which is something we see quite a bit in part 5. And then going from here, almost every single fight in part 5, I'd say, has strengths in it.
Each fight on its own stands out, not only because the characters, they all share these really interesting personalities, which ties back to the way that Part 4 built up all of its characters, but they're all incredibly tense with incredibly abstract abilities. Think of stuff like Soft Machine. That fight is ridiculous, but it's also incredible.
It works.
Because it works. It really stands out, and it really, functions when you think about it. When you understand the base concepts at work, yeah, sure, fuck it. You could put a boat on top of another boat.
Why not?
Why not?
I have to say, that was probably one of the more confusing parts of part 5.
Yeah, no, it's still, an incredibly unique thing. It's an incredibly bizarre thing, and it really speaks to the strengths of part 5.
Oh, for sure. So another thing I want to talk about with part 5 is, coming back to it again, our villain team-ups. We see quite a few of them in here, and so I'm just going to talk about the 2 that we've seen in the anime so far. And so, of course, that's my boys, Prosciutto and Pesci, and my not boys, but still great boys, Squalo and Tiziano. So with Prosciutto and Pesci, we actually have a double of things we've been talking about, because we have villain team up and we have the stands that aren't really violence based from the get-go, with the aging ability combined with Beach Boy, which Beach Boy is really unique and it's a very cool stand.
Yeah.
But the train fight is phenomenal. It's so tense. It's so creative in its use of everything going on between the monitoring for life, the Bruno unzipping his entire body, everyone aging and having to fight against the clock to keep cool and actually live.
I think that, speaking from just personal opinion, the fight against Pesci and Prosciutto on the train is probably my favorite fight in part 5, just because it has so much going for it and so much going on as a whole. But it is very much an accumulation of everything we've seen built up to this point. And I think, using it as an example, it also speaks to some of the greatest strengths in Araki's writing, especially when it comes to fights.
Oh yeah, not even just with fights too. We get a mini character arc for the villains in the train fight, which is fantastic, between Prosciutto being like, Pesci, you gotta stop being such a mommy's boy, you gotta have confidence in yourself. And then at the end, seeing Pesci shift into sicko mode and actually be confident in his ability and use Beach Boy with deadly confidence and accuracy. Another interesting mashup when we see these villain combos is Squalo and Tiziano then with Clash and Talking Heads, because again, we see one of these stands which is not really fit for fighting, paired with a stand that is incredibly fit for fighting, and it makes for something that starts off as kind of this silly situation and very quickly scales downhill into, this is incredibly terrifying, and I am feeling so bad watching Narancia struggle through this.
No, but one thing that is really interesting to note about this fight is, even just looking at the individual stands in this matchup, you've got Clash, which is a straight-up offensive stand. It is a literal shark, and its ability is kind of limited in that it can teleport to different bodies of water, matched with a stand that will make you lie, it will make you say the opposite of everything you want to say. That is, in a way, if you look at them individually, it is part 3 and part 4 coming together. If you were to see Clash on its own in part 3, it would fit in perfectly with the rest of the cast. And if you were to see Talking Heads in part 4 as just like a fun one-off stand, 100% fits in.
Oh, absolutely.
Even their designs, they are the strengths of both parts coming together to not only create a tense and exciting fight between stand users, but it also creates one where miscommunication is a heavy element. We are not only afraid for Narancia because he's facing up against a dangerous stand, but because he himself is helpless in his communication. That, I think, is a very, very interesting combo, and it is something that could not have been done had Araki not gotten that space to experiment with things.
Yeah, part 5 is just made up of all these moments where Araki has learned from everything he's done so far, and it makes for such a great experience. I do want to talk a little bit about the most recent battle where we see Doppio with King Crimson and Epitaph versus Metallica, just because even that is so unique in that we're watching two villains fight each other. We're totally separate from our heroes for a solid 2 episodes. And it still manages to be this amazing tense fight wherein we see another horde ability, for example, with the Metallica, which is a little hard to watch for some people because I think that's the goriest battle in all of JoJo's.
Yeah,
just by nature of what Metallica is. And then at the same time, you have this caveat on King Crimson of, but it's Doppio, so he doesn't have all of King Crimson. He only has the arms and Epitaph, which lets him look 10 seconds into the future.
It in itself is this really unique fight where we ourselves are not really sure who we should be rooting for. Do we want the boss to win? Do we want Metallica to overcome this? Like,
I want Risotto to win.
Well, yeah, naturally we want Risotto to win, but I mean, everybody has their own take on it. But no, it's really fascinating, and it is something that we could only get here. It's something that we could only get with characters who have gotten the development that they have, that they both have the motivation that they have. It is something that would only take place with enough building on that. And I think going to Doppio and going to King Crimson specifically, King Crimson as a villain stand is really the testament to all of that growth in the parts as a whole. Because think back to part 3. We see our main villain is the world with a very standard ability when you think about time manipulation. The world can stop time, and that's it. And that is kind of what we've come to expect from the stands in part 3. Then, when we go to part 4, Killer Queen Bites the Dust, it builds on the idea of manipulating time, but it does so in a more muted, more fitting way for that environment. And so it's a bit more unique and a bit more clever in the way that the ability is set up, but it's still, a bit more standard. Then when we come to King Crimson, the idea of erasing time is so abstract and obviously has built all of these memes around it where naturally people are confused by the way that it works. And that is, I think, a perfect culmination of everything that Part 5 stands are. They are these weird abstract abilities that kind of only really explain themselves in motion. If you told someone the base ability of, say, Babyface, they'd still kind of look at you and tilt their head because it is a little bit hard to grasp on the surface.
To be fair, I think you can kind of tilt your head at Babyface in general, even in context.
Yeah, no, 100%. But yeah, the idea that we've been taking what we've seen previously in our main villain stands, building upon them to create these incredibly tense situations, but still having to change things up and still having to find ways to surprise the viewer it's tough. And so when you have something like part 3 where you're first being introduced to this incredibly intimidating stand with an ability that the Crusaders themselves couldn't comprehend, that was easy when you were starting out with a time stop stand. But now in part 5, Araki needs to establish that same sense of tension within Bucci's gang in a whole new and entirely unique way. So the way that King Crimson can erase time is to Bucciarati's gang what the world's time stop was to the Stardust Crusaders.
But at the same time, it's also that to the audience, in that once again you're put into this situation of I don't know what's going on, and it's terrifying.
Absolutely. It's both terrifying and amazing. Not knowing what's going on, not being able to read the situation, that I think is what all of these JoJo fights kind of are and kind of what they need to be. Because if you can tell what's going to happen 100% of the time, then you're not worried, you're not afraid, you just know, okay, the gang's going to win this one. But if you look at all of these fights as a new viewer, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna go, oh, are they gonna die this time?
Yeah.
Is this the one where they're gonna die?
And see, that's what makes JoJo such an amazing thing to watch / read / however you choose to consume it. You never know. It's not your standard power scaling of alright, this guy can punch a rock apart, this guy can punch a mountain, and this guy can punch the earth apart, Everything is so unique that you don't know what's gonna happen. You can't power scale talking heads versus Oingo Boingo, It doesn't work the same way as a lot of shonen battle stuff.
Yeah, every fight in JoJo is, at its core, it's 3 things. It's your protagonist, your antagonist, and your setting. And that setting is 9 times out of 10 going to play the biggest role in the fight, because every one of these fights is really circumstantial. It could go either way, but because of where this is placed, because of the goings-on around it, that is what gives our hero or our villain or whatever the upper hand. Notorious Big wouldn't have been the same fight had it not taken place in a fucking airplane in the sky.
In a closed space where you can't escape. You can run. There's so little to do and so few places to go that you have to face this horror one-on-one, head-to-head. And that's what makes JoJo's just so amazing. Everything's such a toss-up. Everything's so circumstantial. You will never be able to know what happens next, because everything's gonna be bizarre no matter what.
So yeah, looking back on everything that we've seen so far, we can really tell that Araki himself has learned new things and has become more accustomed to writing these really unique, bizarre fights. And naturally, he's only gonna continue to grow as time goes on. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is this incredibly strange phenomenon that we've all become accustomed to with the parts that we've seen, but it's so hard to nail down exactly what it is. And looking at part 5, looking at these strangely dressed people with extravagant personalities and incredibly bizarre abilities, these are what you think of when you think of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Part 5 is everything that we've seen up to this point, all culminated into one beautiful Italian dish.
And you know what? That's what makes the show really stand out.
God damn it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for putting up with my jokes and, listening to our thoughts about one of our favorite shows. JoJo's has always been a center point for me and Kyle's friendship. That's how we met, actually. Years ago now. But thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for listening.
If you liked what we had to say, maybe subscribe to our channel. We put out other videos like this, and if you enjoyed this one, please leave a like. Also, why don't you let us know what your favorite JoJo's fight is down in the comments.
And who were you cheering for, Doppio or Risotto? There is a clear right choice here.
But still interesting to see what you thought. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.